Well, I think it's fascinating to see the comparison between the two. That was that he would have so early, because this is back in the 70s, that he would have a preference, if you will, or whatever his favorite, I guess that was his word, serial killer. Because we figured out his age, he would have been a teenager back in the late 70s. So that starts early, although that matches what we have found in the work we did with the interviewing the 36 killers. So there's that adolescent period is very, very important. And also he had the loss of his father that we talked about back when he was 11 or 12. So all of that certainly makes for some symbolic, interesting psychological theory.
Awesome. I can't wait. Gary, opening statement on it before we get into the PowerPoint.
Well, I'll say that one of the things that's really fascinating is hearing from these people that interacted either in a chance way or in a daily way with the accused, with Rex. And the picture is rapidly emerging of a person who, on the one hand, was seen as a kind of an ordinary guy that people really didn't think could possibly do anything aggressive. But on the other hand, this guy that could explode or hold an incredible grudge. And the most fascinating thing to me have been women coming forward who say that they had perhaps worked as escorts or so forth, who went out on dates with him and who were not ultimately killed because they didn't go home with him, or were smart enough to kind of figure out that something was up and slip away. Not to suggest that the other victims were not smart enough. I just mean that they fell prey. And then we start to get these incredible glimpses into these vile things that he would talk about on the date. And I think the idea that he would tell one of them that he had a favorite serial killer, which was the Hillside Stranglers duo, I think even though it's getting kind of hidden in all the other discussion about what went on at the date, to people like Anne and me, that insight is perhaps one of the most important, about that he would have been studying the Hillside Stranglers, obsessing over them, idealizing them. And the comparisons between him and Bianchi, which I hope we're going to get into, I mean, they're even on a granular level. You even have to talk about things like that Bianchi lost his father at a very young age and went into total denial of it, which is exactly what I think happened with Heuermann, right? So that we'll have to get into what would have made him gravitate towards these particular guys, and how perhaps that's where he started to get the ideas for some of his sexual fantasies and his wish of what he'd like to be. So let's sort of hold off on that a little bit, but it all comes from that TikTok video that one of these women, these women who survived made. I have the link to it, which I could provide you, Chris, if you want to circulate it.
Right. So let's set the stage again to your initial observation. You see the TikTok video, you see the gal that went out on a date with him. Give our audience a little bit deeper understanding of what was going on there.
So this is one of several people who have come forward talking about these dates. And what she explains is that she claims that Rex flew her out from the West Coast and he took her to dinner in, I think she says, Suffolk County, out a little further out, on the island there. And at the dinner, he starts asking her if she's a true crime fan. And in that conversation, she says, he says, "Do you have a favorite serial killer?" She says, "No, I don't." And he says that he favors the Hillside Stranglers, that they're his favorite. And then allegedly goes on to ask if she's heard of Gilgo Beach and to discuss it, to give some ideas about it. Now, we know from a date that he allegedly went on with a woman named, I think, Nikki Brass, who's been talking, that similarly, she's taken out on a date. He asks if she's a true crime fan. And in that conversation, asking if she's a true crime fan, he asks what she knows about Gilgo Beach. And he starts talking about a hypothetical suspect. And he starts talking about how the killer probably felt about the victims. And he communicates to her essentially that the women would have been non-entities, that they would have been basically wanton women that nobody would care about. And we have to remember that he would be having that conversation with somebody working as an escort. So that it's like an indirect way of kind of calling her a horrible thing, right? And what she says, what Nikki Bress says, is that when he's discussing it, he changes visually and scares her, because he looks as if he's going into almost a trance-like memory and looking really, really into it. And this creeps her out. And then she says that he says to her, you're going to come back to my place. He asks her multiple times. And she says, quote, he becomes agitated, right? When I say no, agitated. She said that he started to say things like, but I paid for dinner and I came all the way out here. You're not going to come back. So she says, it's late. I'd have to drive my car to your place and then drive all the way back. And he starts insisting that they could get into his car, which is interesting also. And here we start getting an answer to the question of, where was he taking these people? Where was he taking these victims? What it sounds like is the goal is to kind of toy with the question of whether they'd be open to some kinky S&M like kind of sex by talking about serial killers that engaged in it. And then the idea seems to be to try to get them almost willingly to get in the vehicle. It's like a vampire. You've got to invite me. And so Gacy used to do that, right? Like to get you to put the rope on yourself, kind of a thing. And then ultimately get you back to his place. That's what it looks like. And apparently he was even speaking to this woman about the burlap sacks, about that it had been in the news that they were found in burlap, and what was the point of that and all that. So I think what you have, and she says, what Brass says, is that it seemed as if he wanted to boast, but he couldn't.
Interesting.
And so I think it would be fascinating to hear Anne's thoughts on this, but this to me sounds pretty classic. Anne, what are you thinking as you're hearing all this about what these dates are saying?
Well, I think it's a test. He certainly had not only did he have a preference for the way he would lure a potential victim in, but then he even had script that he was going to go through, and it depended. He'd probably check it off if they did something that said the right thing or whatever. But the minute they said, no, I don't want to go back to your house, or whatever the kind of the end point was, he would that would interrupt the fantasy, and he'd get very angry. So you wonder when does he kill them? And where does he kill them? We don't know that he takes them back to the house, although I guess there's some information coming out that maybe he did. Or does he, because he has to drive them somewhere after he kills them, unless he kills them out on the beach. Doesn't have much information on any of that about the method of murder. We suspect from what he says that he prefers strangulation, that it isn't clear whether it's ligature or manual. We did a study on that, so I'll be interested to see what they think it was. One of his victims said it was he had put ribbon or something around the neck, so ligature. So I think back to your question, Gary, that it just gives us his script and the whole lore, if you will,
right?
And how much he gets out of playing it. It's like he's the actor and setting the scene.
So it sounds like, to set the stage here even further, you've got Rex in New York, who seems to be somewhat impressed by the two cousins out in California, to the point where he's trying to correlate that to the incidences that are taking place on Long Island. And obviously the gal that's hearing this is just going by, the creepy feeling of what's going on in this conversation, but has no idea of what the extent this guy is, or what this guy is capable of. And that's kind of right along what these two cousins were doing. They were, pretending they were cops. And these are the two investigators who actually took them down Detective Grogan from LAPD and Detective Frank Salerno from LASD. And of course, it was an entire task force that was assembled of almost 100 guys that were chasing leads during that time. And this was just pre, the behavior science unit stuff as you guys were just starting to kick off the study. But the correlation now, thinking about it, and this is the shop. If he was taking him back to his house in New York, these guys were taken to the shop in LA. And this picture I just took off of Google Earth today. That shop is still there on East Colorado in Los Angeles, actually Glendale. But so let's talk a little bit about the psychological aspect of these individuals. So who are these guys, Gary? And Ann, can you guys break that down a little bit deeper for us? I know that Kenneth at 5 suffered from some type of syndrome where his eyes would roll back into his head as a, even at 5 years old.
He had an injury where he sort of face planted, and but according to his mother, she talks about him. Or just to paraphrase what exactly she said, it was something like that he basically came out of the womb lying, that he was like a garden variety juvenile delinquent from day one, and that you couldn't trust anything he said. So that a lot of these stories about his history, you kind of have to take them with a grain of salt. He's like a master liar and manipulator. And I mean, there can be no question. Anyone who looked at him said that he is like the classic psychopath. And what's really interesting is working with another person on serial killing. I mean, Ann and I, if we were to talk about it, could probably name just a few people who did that. Wouldn't you say, Ann? It's rather uncommon entering into that kind of intimacy and working with a partner to kill together. Very rare, right?
Very rare, very rare.
Very rare. And it suggests a kind of a perversion of the construct of like having a friend, right? But what usually happens when you study these paired offenders, sometimes it's your romantic partner, sometimes a relative, a friend, but what tends to happen is that there's one very psychopathic dominant figure, and the other one is a kind of a weaker willed ally who goes along with it. It's very confusing to law enforcement because you can even have two very different profiles that arise if one person does one thing and the other one does the other. But the idea is that Buono was the adoptive cousin to Bianchi. And the interesting thing about Bianchi, who really is the center, I mean, when if it's true that Rex talked about Bianchi being his, about the Hillside Stranglers being his favorite, he really means Bianchi. And Bianchi is, would definitely fall into that Ted Bundy category of psychopathic serial killer, sexually sadistic, very charming, handsome, so forth. And he was somebody who had really a very arrested development psychologically. He lost his father at a very young age and dealt with it by going into a kind of a complete denial that it ever happened. It's very interesting because that's a point I've repeatedly made about Heuermann, is that I felt from the very beginning, I've said it on this show multiple times, that he was sort of arrested at the death of his father, which would have been when he was 11. And here we have a guy obsessed with 10-year-olds and so forth, according to his search histories, that house that is completely unchanged, that he purchases from his mother as if it's some kind of shrine. And you get the sense of a person who never really got past that event, which is exactly what happened with Bianchi. How that figures into the psychology of these individuals is something to think about. We also know that Bianchi, in addition to kind of becoming a master BS artist from the start, honed an MO where he and his cousin would pretend to be police officers, and they would lure women into the car under, in that way. They would pick up sex workers with the idea being that they were in trouble. You're going to have to get in the car. We're going to take you someplace. They were, according to this woman who went on the date with Rex, where he was talking about the Hillside Stranglers, he was explaining that what he liked about them was that they got up close and personal with the victims, so that there was this ability to fearlessly kind of look someone right in the eyes and kill them. And that starts to give a clue of what was probably turning on Rex. That power, that looking somebody in the eye and being the arbiter of whether they live or die. I think it's very interesting that people who are fixated on the deaths of someone in their life would be empowered by being the arbiter of life and death. Having control over who dies would be like a way of undoing that. I get to pick when I lose you. I get to pick when you're dead, right? So that it's a way of overcoming that feeling of powerlessness that would have been left from the death of a loved one. You also have in Rex calling up the family members of a victim and kind of mocking them for losing someone, which again speaks to someone who felt terribly insecure and lost and powerless with the death of this man. So that I think that's very important psychologically. Now with Bianchi, once these women are brought to a workshop area, right, to a place, this isolated place in a very organized way, there's strangulation, and then there's a kind of a honing of the MO to experiment with other things. So they started injecting, with lethal injection, carbon monoxide poisoning, and also electrocution, right? So that you start getting, in other words, it's not enough to strangle, they start getting aroused by torture. And it is interesting to think about what was going on in the experimentation process in some kind of workshop area with Rex, if he is indeed the killer.
Hard working every day, I'm stressed out 24/7, babe. No timeouts, wish we could fly away. You and I go to our favorite place. Oh yeah, make special memories together. I'll be your company now and forever. I say we fly away, you and me, go to our favorite place. Feeling the sun on my face in Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. I need a summer breeze, some fresh air to put my mind at ease. No cares. You wanna come with me? Me and you go to our favorite tree. Are you ready now? We jump on a plane now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. Don't hesitate now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. We'll never come down. We're going away. Yeah, we're going away. You and me. Feeling the sun on my face in a while.